Shaq was just there for a quick trim until he heard the barber say something disgusting. "Sorry, we don't cut people like you. Too much of a hassle." The room went dead silent. A young man in a wheelchair, Ethan, gripped his phone, his face turning red, humiliated. The other customers? They looked away. No one stood up for him. But Shaq? He wasn't about to let this slide. What he did next shut the whole barbershop down. Stay till the end. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The bell above the barbershop door jingled, breaking the low hum of clippers and quiet conversation. The scent of aftershave and warm shaving cream filled the air, blending with the rhythmic snip of scissors. Shaq stepped inside, towering over the chairs and customers, his presence impossible to ignore. He wasn't looking for attention, just a quick trim before heading out. But something at the entrance made him pause. Near the doorway, a young man in a wheelchair hesitated. He clutched a crumpled picture of a haircut, his fingers pressing into the paper as if bracing himself. His name, Shaq later found out, was Ethan. He had the look of someone who had spent a lifetime being overlooked, dismissed. His brown hair was shaggy, curling at the ends, like he hadn't been able to get a cut in months. Ethan glanced around nervously before rolling forward, the soft hum of his wheelchair cutting through the barbershop's chatter. The noise died down as customers noticed him moving toward the empty chair. Then Mitch, the barber behind the counter, crossed his arms and let out a short, unimpressed chuckle. "Sorry, we don't have the setup for people like you," Mitch said, dragging out the last words. The room stiffened. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in their phones or the walls. The younger barber at the corner swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Ethan before looking away. No one spoke up. Ethan froze, his grip tightening around the picture. I just need a trim," he said quietly. Mitch sighed dramatically, shaking his head. "Look, man, I run a business. I don't have time to rearrange the whole shop for one guy in a chair." He gestured vaguely at the workspace. "We don't have ramps, special seats, whatever it is you need. Not my problem." A slow, creeping redness crawled up Ethan's neck. His shoulders slumped, his eyes flickering downward, as if he wished he could disappear into the floor. The rejection hung in the air like thick smoke, suffocating. "Hey, it's fine," Ethan mumbled, already backing up toward the door. "I'll just—" Mitch had already turned away, grabbing his clippers like Ethan was never there. Shaq, sitting nearby, had seen enough. His deep voice rumbled through the shop. "Where you going, big man?" The entire barbershop turned. Ethan stopped, startled, his hands frozen on his wheels. Mitch blinked, looking up, confused for the first time. Shaq leaned forward, locking eyes with Ethan, his expression calm but firm. "You came here for a cut," Shaq said. "So you're getting one." Mitch let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, yeah. And who's gonna make me?" The air inside the barbershop grew thick, the kind of silence that made every movement feel heavier. Shaq leaned forward in his chair, his deep voice slicing through the tension. "What do you mean, people like him?" All eyes darted between Shaq and Mitch, the barber who had just dismissed Ethan without a second thought. Mitch rolled his eyes, his arms crossed, as he exhaled sharply. "Look, man, I don't have the time or equipment to deal with special cases." Ethan flinched. His hands gripped the wheels of his chair so tightly that his fingers trembled. His face was red, not from anger, but humiliation. The kind that burns slow and deep, the kind that makes you feel small in a room full of people. Shaq saw it, and he hated it. Slowly, he stood up. The barbershop wasn't exactly tiny, but Shaq's presence alone made it feel like the walls had closed in a little. He towered over Mitch, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the floor. The barber straightened instinctively, his smirk faltering for just a second. "You mean to tell me, in a shop full of tools, full of so-called professionals, you can't handle cutting a man's hair just because he's in a chair?" Mitch scoffed. "I got other customers to take care of, big guy. Ain't my problem." Shaq let that sit. From the corner, a younger barber shifted on his feet. He looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to say something but was too afraid. The other customers buried their faces in their phones, some pretending not to hear, others recording the moment quietly. Ethan started backing up. "It's fine. I can go somewhere else." Shaq turned, looking down at him. "No, it's not fine." Ethan blinked up at him. Shaq turned back to Mitch. His expression was unreadable, but there was a sharpness in his eyes now, a quiet, restrained intensity that made Mitch swallow, his fingers twitching slightly where they rested on the counter. Shaq cracked his knuckles, the sound cutting through the silence like a warning. "Oh, I think it's about to be your problem." Mitch let out a short, forced laugh, but it was weaker now. The tension in the air was electric. The shop door suddenly swung open behind them, fast enough to make a few heads turn. In walked the owner of the barber shop, and by the look on his face he had heard everything. The shop felt heavier, the air thick with something unspoken. Nobody was laughing, nobody was talking. Shaq sat down in the chair, his towering frame almost swallowing it whole. He stretched his arms and cracked his neck, making sure all eyes stayed on him. Then he gestured toward Ethan, who was still near the entrance, gripping the wheels of his chair. "Ethan, sit tight. Let's see if Mitch here can handle cutting my hair instead." Mitch hesitated. His usual arrogance flickered, just for a second. He forced a tight-lipped smile, trying to act like this was just another customer. "Of course, Mr. Shaq. Right this way," he said, his voice suddenly polite. "Fake." Mitch grabbed his clippers, shaking them once to hide the fact that his hands weren't steady. Shaq leaned back, watching him in the mirror, his expression unreadable. The shop remained eerily silent. Customers who had been casually scrolling on their phones before now had them aimed directly at the chair. Mitch cleared his throat and started the cut. Shaq spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "So, Mitch, what exactly about Ethan made you turn him away?" Mitch fumbled slightly, adjusting his grip on the clippers. "It's just difficult," he muttered. Shaq didn't blink. Difficult or inconvenient? Mitch's jaw tensed. His movements became stiffer. A young barber in the corner shifted uncomfortably, but nobody spoke. Shaq continued, his voice calm but firm. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you had no problem making space for me." Mitch's grip on the clippers faltered again, and this time, he nicked the side of Shaq's fade. A tiny mistake, but Shaq noticed. The tension in the room cranked up another notch. Mitch flinched, as if realizing he just made things worse. Before he could respond, the shop door swung open with force. The sudden clang of the bell made a few people jump. In walked the owner of the barber shop, and by the look on his face, he had heard everything. The barber shop door swung open, letting in a rush of warm afternoon air, before it shut with a quiet thud. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a razor. At the entrance stood Carlos, the owner of the shop, a man in his late 50s, built like a retired boxer, with sharp, dark eyes that had seen a lifetime in the business. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, his polo tucked into crisp jeans, and the gold watch on his wrist gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Carlos didn't miss much. His gaze swept over the silent, uncomfortable customers, the way the young barber in the back looked away nervously, and then finally landed on Mitch, standing rigid behind his station. Carlos's eyes narrowed. Something was off. Then he spotted Shaq, easily the largest man in the room, sitting relaxed in one of the chairs, arms crossed, watching everything unfold. Finally, Carlos's gaze flickered toward the front door, where Ethan sat in his wheelchair, hands gripping the wheels as if bracing himself for another rejection. His face was flushed, eyes darting between Carlos and Mitch. Carlos's friendly expression faltered. He turned back to Shaq, his deep voice filling the shop. "Shaq, my man, good to see you. You back for a cut?" Shaq shook his head slowly, his face unreadable. "Not today. Just came in for a question." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "All right, what's up?" Shaq jerked a thumb toward Ethan. "You know your boy here is turning away paying customers?" Carlos's jaw tightened. The air in the shop shifted. The nervous shuffling of the customers stopped. The younger barbers froze mid-motion, clippers humming idly in their hands. Carlos's eyes, dark and sharp, swung back to Mitch. His tone was quiet, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "That true?" Mitch scoffed, though the stiffness in his shoulders betrayed his unease. He waved a dismissive hand at Ethan. "Look, I wasn't trying to be rude, but he's in a wheelchair. It's just a hassle." A few low gasps rippled through the room. A woman near the waiting area shifted uncomfortably. The young barber standing near the sink winced, but said nothing. Carlos's face remained unreadable. "A hassle," he repeated, his voice a notch quieter. That was worse. Mitch let out a breathy, nervous chuckle. "I just mean, it's not easy setting him up. I got other customers to handle. You know how it is." Carlos took one slow step forward. "No, Mitch, I don't know how it is." The room was silent except for the faint buzzing of a distant clipper. Carlos kept his voice calm, but his eyes held fire. Let me remind you how we do things here. This shop has always been for everyone. We cut hair, that's it. We don't pick and choose who's worth our time. Mitch's Adam's apple bobbed. Carlos exhaled, shifting his gaze to Ethan. His face softened immediately. Sir, if you're still willing, I'll personally cut your hair myself. Ethan's eyes widened. For the first time since walking in, hope flickered across his face. Before he could respond, a sharp scoff filled the air. Mitch. His arms crossed tightly, a bitter sneer curling his lip. You're really gonna let him tell you how to run your shop? Carlos turned back to Mitch. This time his patience was gone. You better watch your mouth. Mitch let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head as if the entire situation was ridiculous. Test what theory, big guy? Shaq tilted his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. The one where you think you get to decide who deserves respect. The shop was dead silent. Carlos, arms crossed, let out a slow breath before fixing a sharp glare on Mitch. You're on thin ice, man. Apologize. Mitch scoffed. For what? It's not like I refused him. I just didn't want the hassle. A few customers exchanged uneasy glances. No one was buying his excuse. That's when Ethan finally spoke. His voice was quiet but firm. I don't want special treatment. I just wanted a haircut like anyone else. The words hung in the air. Mitch blinked. His jaw tensed slightly, but his arms remained firmly crossed. His eyes flickered around the room, looking for support, but none came. The young barber standing near the sink shifted on his feet but didn't speak up. The other customers kept their heads down, pretending to check their phones or look at the walls. No one was on Mitch's side. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his face. Shaq leaned forward, his towering presence impossible to ignore. His deep voice was steady, unshakable. You see, Mitch, respect isn't about convenience. It's about doing what's right. Mitch swallowed but held his ground. Carlos stepped closer, voice low and steady. You had your chance to fix this? You gonna do the right thing, or are we done here? Mitch exhaled sharply, looking at Ethan. Really looking at him, for the first time. The guy wasn't asking for anything extra. He wasn't demanding special treatment. He just wanted to be treated like every other customer who walked through that door. Mitch opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Shaq raised a hand, stopping him. Hold up. Mitch froze. Shaq studied him, his expression unreadable. You really about to say sorry just because you got backed into a corner? Mitch's face twitched. Carlos sighed, rubbing his temples. Shaq's right. A forced apology don't mean anything, so let's try something else. He turned to Ethan. You still want that cut? Ethan hesitated but nodded. Carlos jerked his chin toward Mitch. Then Mitch is gonna do it. The air in the shop shifted. Mitch stiffened. Wait, what? Carlos didn't blink. You want to prove you're not a bad guy? Then cut his damn hair. Ethan looked at Mitch, then at Shaq. His hands gripped his wheels tightly. I don't want someone touching my hair if they don't respect me. Shaq gave him a nod of approval. Fair. Carlos exhaled. All right, then I'll do it. Mitch glanced between them, his face hard to read, but there was something there. Regret? Guilt? It was a flicker of something. Shaq watched him closely. And right now, you got one last chance to fix this. Mitch's hands curled into fists at his sides. Then, to everyone's surprise, he let out a long breath and reached for the clippers. Mitch scoffed, shaking his head like this whole situation was some kind of joke. I don't need a lecture, big guy. His voice was sharp, dripping with defiance. Shaq raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, slam! Carlos, the owner, slammed his palm onto the counter, rattling the cash register. You're fired, Mitch. The shop went dead silent. A customer in the corner stopped mid-sip of his drink. A young barber at the back, who had been pretending not to listen, froze in place. Even Ethan, still gripping his wheels, looked up in shock. Mitch blinked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Then he let out a bitter laugh. Seriously? Over this? Carlos didn't flinch. We don't treat people like that. Pack your stuff. For a moment, Mitch just stood there, rigid, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Then suddenly, his chair scraped against the floor as he turned toward Shaq, pointing a finger at him. This your idea of justice? Getting a man fired? Shaq, completely unfazed, leaned back against the counter and folded his arms. I didn't fire you, Mitch. You did that all by yourself. Mitch's face twisted in anger. You just walk into my shop and act like you own the place? You think you're some kind of hero? Shaq shook his head slowly, his voice calm but firm. Nah, I just don't like watching people get disrespected. Mitch's hands balled into fists. His breath came out sharp and uneven, his anger barely contained. This is ridiculous, he muttered under his breath. Carlos sighed, rubbing his temples. Mitch, man, just go. Mitch's eyes flickered around the shop, as if searching for someone to back him up, but no one did. The other barbers wouldn't meet his gaze. The customers kept their heads down. No one was on his side. Mitch scoffed again, but it wasn't as confident this time, more like a desperate last attempt to keep his pride intact. This is a joke, he spat. I gave this shop years of my life. You're really throwing me out over some wheelchair guy? Ethan flinched but didn't look away. Carlos's expression hardened. We're throwing you out because you don't respect people. Mitch opened his mouth to argue, then snapped it shut. His face darkened. He grabbed his clippers off the counter and stuffed them into a small duffel bag. Shaq watched him, expression unreadable. As Mitch reached the door, he turned back one last time. His eyes locked onto Shaq, filled with resentment. You think you won, huh? His voice was low, almost dangerous. Shaq smirked. Oh, I'm just getting started. Mitch's knuckles went white against the door handle. Then, he slammed it behind him, leaving the shop in stunned silence. The barber shop was still buzzing from the fallout of Mitch's firing. Whispers filled the space. Barbers exchanged glances, and customers sat in stunned silence. The tension was thick, but Shaq? He was as calm as ever. With a deep exhale, Shaq pushed himself up from the barber's chair, towering over everyone in the room. All right, Carlos. How much would it cost to upgrade this place? Carlos frowned, confused. Upgrade? What do you mean? Shaq glanced at Ethan, who still sat awkwardly in his wheelchair near the entrance, unsure whether to leave or stay. I mean, I want this shop to be fully accessible. For everyone. Carlos blinked. He glanced around his shop, as if seeing it through a new lens. The chairs were fixed to the ground, limiting movement. The floor had a step leading to the back area, making it nearly impossible for a wheelchair to get through. The younger barbers, who had stayed quiet throughout the confrontation, started nodding in agreement. One of them, a guy in his early 20s with a sharp fade and steady hands, spoke up. Honestly, man, that's a solid idea. We should have done this a long time ago. Another barber chimed in. Yeah, we got customers who come in on crutches sometimes and we struggle to seat them. This would help a lot. Carlos scratched his chin, clearly thinking it over. That's, not cheap, Shaq. Shaq grinned, pulling out his phone. Good thing I don't do cheap. Mitchen is still standing near the door, jobless and fuming, scoffed. Oh, so now you're just gonna throw money at the problem? Typical rich guy move. Shaq didn't even look at him. Instead, he dialed a number and waited. Within seconds, a deep voice answered. Yo, Shaq, what's good? Shaq smirked. I got a little project. I need a barbershop revamped. Fast. Carlos's eyes widened. Wait, are you serious? Shaq held up a finger, signaling for silence as he kept talking. Yeah, man, I need full wheelchair accessibility, adjustable chairs, ramps, maybe even automatic doors. Think you can make it happen? The voice on the other end chuckled. For you. Consider it done. Mitch's face twisted with disbelief. You're really doing all this? For what? Some guy in a wheelchair? Shaq finally turned to him, his expression unreadable. Nah, I'm doing this for everyone. Carlos shook his head in awe, laughing under his breath. Damn, Shaq, you don't play around. Shaq winked. Nope, and by the time I'm done, this place is going to be the best damn barbershop in town. Mitch, now jobless, watches in stunned silence as Shaq scrolls through his contacts. Time to make a few more calls. The rumble of a drill echoed through the shop as workers moved in and out, carrying planks of wood, toolboxes, and sheets of fresh tile. The once outdated barber shop was now a full-fledged construction site. Carlos stood near the front, arms crossed, shaking his head in disbelief. Man, this is really happening. Shaq smirked, watching as a group of workers installed a sleek, silver ramp leading up to the front door. Told you I don't play around. Inside, the changes were even more dramatic. The bulky, outdated barber chairs were being swapped out for brand new, adjustable ones that could accommodate any customer, standing, sitting, or rolling. The floors were redone with smooth, non-slip material, and the cramped aisles had been widened for easy access. One of the younger barbers, a guy named Leo, whistled as he ran his fingers along the fresh leather of a new chair. Man, I've worked in some nice shops, but this is next level. Carlos laughed, clapping a hand on Shaq's shoulder. You just turned my little barber shop into a five-star spot, big guy. Just then, the door swung open. Ethan rolled inside, his eyes widening at the changes. His gaze swept across the shop, from the new ramps to the modified barber stations designed specifically for customers like him. His hands tightened on his wheels as he whispered, "No way. You really did all this?" Shaq knelt slightly to be at eye level with Ethan. "Not for people like you, for people like us, because we all deserve respect." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding. Yeah, yeah, we do." Carlos grinned. "So you still want that cut?" Ethan chuckled. "Man, I've been waiting all week." As Ethan was led to a chair, a voice from the back of the shop muttered, "Unbelievable." Shaq turned just as one of the construction workers nudged him. "Hey, you see the news?" Shaq took the worker's phone and glanced at the screen. A headline popped up. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal revamps barbershop to promote inclusivity. The article was already trending. The post had thousands of shares with comments flooding in, praising the move, calling out discrimination, and celebrating a barbershop that welcomed everyone. Shaq smiled. "Now that's what I like to see." Carlos chuckled. "Man, we're about to have a line out the door once this place officially opens." But before Shaq could respond, the front door creaked open again. Mitch stood in the doorway. His usual cocky smirk was gone, his shoulders sagged, and his expression was one of pure desperation. The entire shop went silent. Every barber, every worker, and every customer turned to stare. Mitch swallowed hard, glancing around at the shop's transformation. His jaw clenched, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely uncertain of what to say. Finally, he spoke. "Carlos, I need to talk." Shaq leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You sure about that?" The door creaked open, and for the first time since Shaq had set foot in the shop, the room fell completely silent. The air felt different. Every head turned toward the entrance. Mitch stood there, but he wasn't the same Mitch. The arrogance? Gone. The smug confidence in his posture? Replaced with uncertainty. The man who once towered over others with his attitude now looked small. Carlos, standing behind the counter, didn't blink. His jaw tightened. "You lost?" Mitch's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. His fingers twitched at his sides. The man who used to bark orders and roll his eyes at customers couldn't even meet Carlos's gaze. "Carlos, man." Mitch's voice cracked slightly. He coughed, clearing his throat, then tried again. "I need my job back." His words hung in the air like cigarette smoke. No one moved, no one spoke. One of the younger barbers, a kid no older than 19, let out a low whistle. A couple of customers exchanged glances. Ethan, seated comfortably in his new wheelchair-friendly station, paused mid-conversation just to watch. Carlos exhaled slowly, drumming his fingers against the counter. His expression didn't change. "This shop isn't for people like you." Mitch's face paled. He looked around the shop, as if searching for someone to take his side. But there was no smirking customer nodding along with him this time. No co-worker subtly agreeing. It was just him, alone. Shaq, sitting in the waiting area with his massive arms folded over his chest, tilted his head. Why the sudden change of heart? His voice was even, calm, but there was an edge to it. Mitch let out a nervous chuckle, but it came out hollow. He rubbed the back of his neck, fingers trembling slightly. I got turned down at 3 other shops." The truth spilled from his lips before he could stop it. Word spread. He exhaled sharply, finally meeting Carlos's eyes. "No one wants to hire me." Silence. A weight settled over the room. One of the younger barbers shook his head, muttering under his breath. An older customer sitting near the front let out a low sigh, crossing his arms. Mitch wasn't the first person to be treated unfairly, but this was probably the first time he'd ever been on the receiving end. Shaq studied him for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So now you understand what it's like, huh?" Mitch's jaw tightened. He didn't speak right away. For the first time in his life, he didn't have an excuse. No quick remark, no justifications, no blaming someone else. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "Yeah." Carlos tapped his fingers on the counter. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The shop had never been this quiet. Mitch stood frozen near the entrance, his usual cocky smirk completely gone. His hands balled into fists at his sides, not in defiance, but in barely contained desperation. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Carlos, man, I need my job back." The other barbers stopped what they were doing, eyes flicking between Mitch, Carlos, and Shaq. Even the customers seemed to sense the weight of the moment. Carlos let out a slow, disappointed sigh. "This shop isn't for people like you." Mitch flinched like he'd been slapped. He had said those exact words to Ethan. Shaq leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his massive chest, his expression unreadable. Why the sudden change of heart? Mitch hesitated. His eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet their gazes. For the first time, the man who always ran his mouth had nothing to say. Finally, after a long silence, he exhaled shakily. I got turned down at 3 other shops." Shaq's brows lifted slightly, but he said nothing. Mitch swallowed hard. Word spread. "No one wants to hire me." His voice was low, filled with something that almost sounded like regret. Almost. Carlos shook his head. "Funny how that works, huh?" Mitch's jaw clenched. His pride was still fighting his reality, but reality was winning. Shaq's deep voice rumbled through the shop, cutting through the silence. "So now you understand what it's like to be treated unfairly, huh?" Mitch's lips parted like he wanted to argue, to defend himself. But what was there to say? He had done this exact thing to Ethan. He had humiliated a paying customer, told him he wasn't welcome. Now, the whole town had done the same to him. He exhaled sharply and nodded, shoulders sagging in defeat. "Yeah." Shaq let that sit for a moment, let Mitch feel the weight of it. Then finally he uncrossed his arms. "All right." Mitch blinked in surprise. "All right?" Shaq nodded. "You want another shot?" His tone was calm, measured. "Prove it." Mitch looked stunned. He clearly hadn't expected a second chance. Carlos stepped forward, reaching behind the counter. He pulled out an old, slightly battered broom. The shop went dead silent as he tossed it at Mitch's feet. "You start at the bottom." Mitch stared at it. His face burned with humiliation. Sweeping? He had been the top barber here for years. The guy who booked the most clients, made the most money. And now, Carlos was treating him like a rookie, like a nobody. His hands curled into fists again. He wanted to lash out, wanted to call this unfair. But then, his eyes flickered to Shaq and to Ethan, the young man in the wheelchair, the one he had turned away without a second thought. For the first time, he saw his own actions through someone else's eyes. He had made Ethan feel like this, like he didn't belong, like he wasn't worth the effort. A lump formed in Mitch's throat. Carlos wasn't punishing him. He was making him earn it. Shaq took a slow step forward, towering over Mitch. "And if we see even one sign of disrespect," the entire shop seemed to lean in. Mitch swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He already knew the answer. Shaq's voice dropped lower. "You're out? For good." The soft whoosh of the broom against the shop's freshly tiled floor was the only sound filling the room. Mitch kept his head down, sweeping in slow, careful motions. Not because he was concentrating, but because he could feel every pair of eyes on him. The customers whispered among themselves, some shooting sideways glances his way. He wasn't just another barber anymore. He was the guy who got humbled, the guy who got what he deserved. Mitch gritted his teeth. He had earned that reputation, he knew that. But still, he hated it. He used to own this shop. Not literally, but in spirit. People wanted his chair. They asked for him by name. Now he was pushing dirt into a dustpan while the shop moved on without him. The soft hum of clippers buzzed in the background, blending with conversation and laughter. Sounds he used to be part of. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sound of wheels rolling across the floor. Mitch stiffened, his fingers curled around the broom handle, his knuckles white. He didn't have to look up to know who had just entered, but he did. Ethan rolled in with confidence head high, not hesitant, not nervous. The first time he had entered, he had barely crossed the threshold before Mitch had made him feel unwelcome. Now, he belonged here, and Mitch was the outsider. Carlos greeted Ethan with a warm smile. "Welcome back, my man." Ethan smiled. "Thanks." Then his sharp gaze flicked to Mitch. Mitch instinctively stepped aside, clearing the path. It wasn't even a conscious action, just pure instinct. And Ethan noticed. The shop went dead silent. All the barbers paused, Even the customers stopped talking. The tension in the air thickened as Ethan studied him. Mitch could feel sweat prickling the back of his neck. And then, Ethan rolled right up to Mitch's chair. Mitch swallowed. "You gonna cut my hair or not?" The words hit harder than any punch. Mitch's fingers twitched around the broom handle. He could still walk away, still refuse. But if he did, that was it. His last shot, his last chance at redemption. His heart pounded as he slowly set the broom aside. He reached for the clippers. His fingers trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the familiar weight. This chair used to be his kingdom. Now, it felt like a battlefield. Mitch inhaled sharply, forcing his voice to stay steady. Yeah, man." His fingers hovered over the lever on the clippers. He flicked them on. The familiar buzz filled the air. Ethan nodded once and smiled. "Cool." Mitch lifted the clippers to Ethan's head, carefully beginning the cut. The silence in the shop was suffocating at first, but then the tension eased. Conversation slowly returned. Barbers got back to their customers. The customers got back to their small talk. And for the first time in a long time, Mitch felt like a barber again. Not a failure, not a joke, just a man doing his job. Shaq, watching from the side, nodded approvingly. Now that's more like it. But then the door jingled open again, and someone unexpected walked in. The buzz of clippers filled the barbershop, blending with the low murmur of conversation. But the energy? It was different now. Where there had once been unease, there was now warmth. Where tension had ruled, laughter took its place. And in the center of it all, Mitch, a man who had once turned a customer away, now working tirelessly to prove he belonged. He was quieter these days, more focused. He greeted every customer with a nod, his hands steady, his attitude changed. But the real proof, he never hesitated when Ethan rolled through the door. No more second glances, no more hesitation, just a barber and a customer. Carlos, the owner, watched from behind the counter, arms crossed. A proud smile tugged at his lips. "It's wild, huh?" he murmured, glancing at Shaq. Shaq, stretched out in the chair, grinned. "What's wild?" Carlos chuckled. "This place. How fast things can change." Shaq nodded. "Yeah, but change don't happen by itself. Someone's got to push." Carlos smirked. "Well, you sure gave us one hell of a push." Shaq tilted his head, studying the room. Customers relaxed in their chairs, chatting with barbers who actually listened. An old man laughed at a joke one of the younger barbers cracked. A kid kicked his feet in excitement, holding up a picture of the haircut he wanted. And at the back of the shop, Ethan, sitting comfortably in a chair, getting his cut. Shaq smiled. "Yeah, this is how it's supposed to be." Carlos finished up Shaq's cut, brushing off loose hairs before spinning the chair toward the mirror. "What do you think, big man?" Shaq studied his reflection, running a hand over the fresh fade. Then he grinned. "Carlos, you did good, man." Carlos shook his head. "Nah, we all did." They clasped hands in a firm shake, a silent understanding passing between them. This was more than just a barbershop now. It was a statement, a place where everyone belonged. Shaq stood, stretching his massive frame. Carlos chuckled. "You sure you don't want to buy the place? Call it Shaq's Cuts?" Shaq laughed. "Tempting, but nah, this is your shop. I just made sure it was on the right track." As Shaq turned toward the door, a voice called out, "Hey, Shaq!" He turned. Ethan grinned, his confidence no longer shaken. "You ever need a fresh cut, you know where to come." Shaq chuckled, stepping backward toward the door. "Bet on it, little man."